over.
We are recording now, just so everyone knows.
Thank you for telling us that.
Fantastic. Thanks, Bella. Well, there's 5 of us on the line, so maybe we want to jump in and get going so we can start working through our agenda.
Sounds good.
That sounds great. Lance, I think you're up on our agenda today to chat about our sole item.
Thanks, Chertesky, and thanks everyone for being here. This should be a nice break from all the conversations about marijuana we've had recently, and maybe just a time to reflect more broadly on policy and approach around multimodal infrastructure. So this is a presentation I've given a couple times to a few different groups, including our Urban Trails Committee, and I think offers a valuable perspective in a couple of regards. The presentation is on bicycling and social equity, and I'll ask if everyone can see my screen.
Looks good.
Great. And, really intended not to zero in on any particular project going on in the city right now or anything like that. It's an opportunity to think a little more holistically about the way that we approach bicycle infrastructure, bicycle programming, and the constituencies in mind when we develop our policy and prioritize infrastructure development. So I'd like to begin with this slide, which is a slide that makes me want to not be in the office. And, here we see what many of us probably think of as a typical Grand Valley cyclist, right? Having a great time, recreating, maybe spent more than they meant to on that bicycle because it's that fun and feels worth it. And of course, we've got these awesome amenities that people come from all around the world to bike on. And this presentation is going to stray a little bit away from this type of cyclist. But up front, want to say that obviously this type of cyclist is a huge asset in our community, a big part of our community for many reasons. And, in no part is this presentation designed to shirk the importance of that type of person, that type of cyclist, but just to start expanding our thinking maybe beyond the characterization that this picture might embody. Now, when we think about a lot of our existing bike ped strategy, whether that's through our plans and policies, through our capital improvement plan, through just kind of the routine updates that we do throughout our system, and then I think the way that we talk about it broadly, we have a genre of solutions that I think are encapsulated here in a lot of this list, right? So we talk about policies and facility upgrades that are going to improve safety. We're talking about bike share systems and micro mobility, maybe scooters and that type of thing. We have conversations on Urban Trails Committee right now about making some tweaks to the bike parking code so that the bike parking that's being installed at new facilities is as amenable as possible to your cyclists. We've got programs that tie together businesses and cyclists. We've got our Bike Month program. We've had our Community Streets event in the past. We focus a lot of energy on our safe routes to school, fixing our trail gaps, making strategic interventions in our sidewalk network that have a lot of bang for the buck. We also look at our auto parking supply, right? I think that's been a big conversation with comprehensive plan. The UTC has asked many times, about a potential dedicated staff member that focuses only on bike and ped issues, and that's certainly the type of position that exists in a lot of larger communities. And then we've got kind of a variety of events and programming. Now, what a lot of these solutions tend to have in common is that they focus on a particular type of cyclist who can be compelled to choose to bike if these programs and facilities are in place. And so many of these are really designed around get the citizen or the resident out of their car and onto their bicycle by making it more viable and more enticing. And that's a very real component of the system and obviously a huge demographic of cyclists in the community. But it's not the only demographic of cyclists. So this presentation will really focus on that other demographic not those who want to bike, but those who have to bike. I think of them as the wanna and the gotta cyclists. So the want to bike type of person typically has, invested something in their gear, may do it for ethical reasons, may do it because it's cool, and it's a hipster thing to do. I used to play bike polo, like that picture in the bottom left, and they might recreate, and oftentimes those want to cyclist type of folks end up being the ones that participate in the political process around cycling. On the other hand, we've got a large demographic of cyclists who are bound to that mode. It may be their primary mode for several reasons. They may not have access to a car. They may not be of age to use a car. They may not have the time to participate in political processes around cycling, but they're biking anyway. And so we will focus in today on that demographic of cyclists that need to bike for these various reasons and look at why they need to bike and how we might be able to better serve that population. Just a word next on how I got into this. I was lucky to grow up in Fort Collins, which is one of the most bikeable communities in the country and in the state. Had the opportunity to study abroad in the Netherlands, which is kind of the mecca for cycling. You can see in the bottom left of this slide a map of all the bicycle infrastructure in the Netherlands and Belgium relative to the neighboring countries, and you can see just how robust that system is. So it really drove home for me how incredible it is to live without a car in an environment that actually fosters that experience. But I also really was turned on to this when I was in high school. My uncle, who was living in Twin Cities at the time, was between his third and fourth DUIs, and he was living near this interchange there on the top right. And it was suggested by some other family members that he get a bicycle and bike to work, as he could no longer drive. And you can see on the bottom right there the kind of facility that he had to drive or had to bike on or had previously driven on. And so this got me really thinking about, how do we provide for folks who are in a position where they can't be driving a car anymore in a society where obviously we're pretty car centric. So that's a little background on why I think this way. These are just three overgeneralizations. I don't think any of these statements are wrong, but I think they're important to question in terms of whether they apply to everyone equally, right? So we've talked about this a little already, but first overgeneralization is that cyclists are people that choose to bike over another mode. The second is that the quality of facilities determines whether people are going to make that choice. I think it's wrong, but it may be an overgeneralization. And then third, we have the assumption that infrastructure alone, hardscape improvements are what it takes to make a city bike friendly. And these types of overgeneralizations really underpin a lot of what we think of as urban planning best practices around cycling. So one of the best models for understanding cyclist choice was developed in Portland. It's the 4 types of cyclist model. And the idea is that there's a third of people that have no interest in biking. There's, about another 2/3 of people that are interested in cycling, but aren't going to do it in most circumstances. And then there's these narrower bands of people that are, enthusiastic about it enough to do it under most circumstances. And then a very narrow subset of people that will ride, fearlessly under pretty much any conditions at all. Perhaps the challenge with this model is that it doesn't capture those whose level of interest really has no bearing on whether they are required to make a choice to bicycle. So what I'm going to do next is go through a series of really data-driven and subject-by-subject analyses of conditions that might lead to somebody being in that need to bicycle category. And then we'll kind of turn around and look at, well, how can you facilitate a better system for that type of individual? So the first factor to look at here is the cost associated with a car-driven society versus a bicycle-oriented society. In the United States, on average, it costs somewhere between $8,000 and $9,000 a year to own a car, and that includes average payments and insurance and maintenance and whatnot. So given that the median U.S. income is just over $60,000 for a household, and that the number of cars in your average household approaches 2, that suggests that really about 1/3 of your average American household's income is going to owning an automobile, which is pretty extreme and might not be intuitive for many of us. Moreover, there are plenty of households that don't have access to a car at all. About 8% of adult Americans do not have car access. And obviously some of that is because they're living in an environment where that might not be necessary. But a whole lot of that is also due to income constraints and other involuntary circumstances. It's very expensive to have a car. And then there's this other side of the income perspective here, where we can look at the demographics of our commuting cyclist community and how they line up on our income scale nationwide. So only about 0.5% of all Americans bike to work, and that's, I think, 2017 data, so it says there. But that demographic is not evenly composed. So if we look at the Sun Belt, which is southern United States, from Florida through Texas and into Southern California and reaching up basically to Grand Junction in its northerly extent, we find that 50% of all bike commuters are living at or below the poverty line. So that obviously is a far disproportionate to the total percent of Americans living at or below the poverty line. We also find that there's a significant cost burden, particularly in that lower than average income category for car ownership. So oftentimes when we talk about housing, many of you are going to be familiar with the idea of a cost burdened household spending a third or more of its income on rent. But as you can see, based on our best available data, households living below $50,000 a year in income are actually typically spending more on commute than on housing. So you've got plenty of housing cost burden individuals, but rarely do we talk about transportation cost burden. And obviously those two things are intertwined when we think about space and lifestyle and urban design. So income is a huge driving factor in terms of people's access to cars and then their behavior around cycling. There's also a lot of race-related factors related to cycling, and this includes both willingness to participate and then outcomes, and then also perceptions of cycling. So nationwide, Native Americans and Latinos are significantly more likely to bicycle than white Americans are when it comes to commuting. Interestingly as well, people of color in this country, based on surveys in 2018 and 2019, are more likely to have a positive view of cyclists than white Americans, whether they are in the driver's seat or in the bicycle seat. We also are seeing an increase in participation in the cycling network from people of color. In particular, there was, I think, about a 30% increase in the number of Black cyclists, commuters, and recreators from 2001 to 2009, based on survey data. And there's some great details about that in the Bike League of the United States. They did an equity report, I think 3 years ago, that captured a lot of that stuff. There's also this difference in outcomes. So for people of color on a bicycle, you're much more likely to get injured. And you can see there that 20 to 30% higher injury rate, rather fatality rate for Black and Latino cyclists relative to white American cyclists. Another great resource on this is this guy, Robin Mazumder, who's a Canadian psychologist. He's a clinical therapist and a cog neuro PhD. And he has really fascinating research where he has put essentially like a helmet where you can measure various neural impulses that are obviously way beyond my educational understanding. But he has put these helmets and monitored the neurological response of cyclists and of drivers in various scenarios and of various demographics. So men, women, people of various races and ages. And he's found that for cyclists of color, there is a substantially different reaction to perceived hazards and a tendency to regard hazards with less confidence. And then in white drivers, he found a significant, essentially a significantly higher level of disregard for cyclist safety than among drivers of color. So these are obviously just some sources, and there's a variety of data around this, but it certainly indicates that a certain amount of outcomes and also willingness to participate in cycling revolve around race to some extent. Another key factor, and one that I think is particularly relevant here in the Grand Junction community, which has struggled to provide housing for all of its residents, and then also obviously we have a long history of having a large transit population. There's this relationship between homelessness and cycling. One of the key concepts here is just stigmatization. There are numerous studies that suggest the over-policing and stigmatization of homeless cyclists. So, for example, it was found that in a 5-year period in Seattle, of 117 tickets that were issued for cyclists not wearing a helmet, 60 or more % of those were homeless individuals. And there's some pretty shocking, video evidence of treatment of homeless cyclists not wearing helmets by police and residents in Seattle. And this has led to the rise of a lot of commentary about riding while homeless, which is kind of the corollary to the driving while black idea. There is a variety of commentary about the empowerment of homeless people through cycling, and then the kind of corresponding stigmatization of homeless cyclists. There's also a significant relationship between the infrastructure density and quality in a city, and then the concentration spatially of homeless and transient residents. So this is another kind of piece of the puzzle here, where we see homeless folks being more likely to need to bike, and then that having ramifications for their safety and security. Another key consideration here is documentation status. So only 16 states in the United States allow for undocumented individuals to obtain a driver's license. Obviously, that doesn't necessarily prohibit an undocumented person from driving, but it does prohibit them from doing so legally, which is a big challenge. We also see that there is an intersection between documentation status and the income question that we discussed at the top of the hour. So you see about a 40% less hourly earning among undocumented individuals of all nationalities of origin relative to American born or American citizens. There's also a fair amount of documentation and research that indicates that immigrants across the board, documented or not, are more likely to bus, carpool, bike, walk, or take other non-car modes, that is, non-personal car modes. So all told, there is this kind of multifaceted relationship between one's documentation status and one's ability to drive. Of course, if you are unable to drive, then you're more likely to be taking advantage of these other modes. Another one to consider is carceral status, which is, of course, whether you are in a relationship with the justice system that's limiting your ability to operate a motor vehicle in a car-centric society. So as I mentioned, one major issue here is DUIs. So depending on your state and your specific circumstance, a DUI or multiple DUIs can certainly take your keys away. And there are about 1 million DUIs each year in the United States, which is a startlingly large number. There's also a relationship between incarceration and income. So I think it's broadly understood that it's harder to get a job if you have recently come out of incarceration. And so as you can see here, the average annual earning, the year out of jail or prison rather, for an individual is $10,000, which is drastically lower than your broader average. Then there is some fascinating research into the spatial relationships related to incarceration. So the prison population is obviously unevenly composed in many respects, but one of those respects is spatial. So there's a very interesting study that was a cooperation between a couple universities and media institutions that went through and examined thousands and thousands and thousands of records on incarcerated individuals. And this project was called the $1 Million Block Project, because what it was aimed at doing was tallying the amount of money spent by taxpayers essentially on incarcerating individuals who have residency status on a given block. So here you can see some of the numbers for neighborhoods in the city of Chicago, as well as a map on the right, which corresponds kind of darker color is the higher intensity of incarceration there. So you can see that there is a spatial imbalance in incarceration. And if you were to layer a bicycle facility quality map over this map of Chicago, you'd find that Lincoln Park up in the north has some of the best bicycle infrastructure in the entire city and some of the lowest incarceration rates in central Chicago, whereas the south side of Chicago is largely bike lane free in many places. So there is a relationship there in terms of ability to bike for an individual and then the environment in which people that are policed and incarcerated are actually biking. There's also a lot of great data and programs and articles out there that you can explore about the relationship between cycling and rehabilitation from incarceration. So a lot of really cool programs out there focused on bicycles as a means of moving forward. Then I think there's what is maybe the most intuitive of all these relationships, which is that of age and access to cycling versus a car. So of course, until you're 16, you're not driving a car. And there is a plethora of research that suggests that kids that are enabled to have some sort of mobility independence between the ages of 12 and 16 because of a bicycle or a walkable neighborhood are going to see more social and economic empowerment with a lot of positive long-term impacts there. And then there's also a certain amount of risk associated with being young. So at the same time as we see a lot of positive effects for a kid being able to access cycling and the world through it, there is a pretty substantial increase in risk the younger you get for being injured or killed on a high-risk facility while you're on your bike. On the other side of that coin, we have the elderly, right? So I think that's an increasingly important topic in our society as we're seeing a larger and larger population aging into a different kind of social and physical environment. But cycling not only has a bunch of health benefits, but there's also increasing research about the benefits of the autonomy that cycling provides to someone who can no longer bicycle or who may live in a situation where their family can't drive them around. So these are important to keep in mind as well. And then as we kind of get through some of these just factors, one to keep in mind is not so much about individuals' demographics, but purely a spatial question. So, of course, over the last 50 to 70 years, the United States has in many ways shifted from a rural and urban country to a very suburban country. What this graph shows is since 2000, the relative increase in population among urban cores there on the left through suburbs into exurbs on the right. And generally speaking, the further you get on the right of this graph, the more horizontal space is taken up by each individual, and typically the more car dependent you're getting. So overall, we're seeing a shift toward suburban lifestyles here, which are not as readily compatible with cycling in terms of density and access to services. And at the same time, as we're seeing broad suburbanization and maybe even some reverses in that trend in certain areas, we're seeing a continued suburbanization of poverty. So suburban poverty is growing 5 times faster than urban poverty, that is poverty in really high density urban cores, which means that we're getting an increasing intersection between folks that may not have the economic resources to be car dependent with environments that do not facilitate any lifestyle that is not car dependent. And the farther you get, typically the higher speed the facility is. So when we look at our exurbs, we're looking at 45-mile-an-hour type of facilities, where in a tighter urban core, it might be a 20, 25-mile-an-hour facility to get to the corner store. So that spatial aspect certainly overlaps with others, and that's a good segue into this concept of intersectionality. And by intersectionality, I don't just mean the quality of being an intersection between streets. But I'm using the definition by Kimberly Crenshaw, who really coined that term. I like to use her definition here, a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. But if you look at the denser definition from the Oxford English Dictionary, what it tells you is that it's a tool for looking at how all these factors that we've discussed separately can collide and intersect in a single person's life, and how they impact that person's ability to participate in society in various ways. So I believe that leads us into potentially a discussion or maybe some questions around, how can the city of Grand Junction treat its population and its environment in a way that recognizes the intersection of all of these forces on the lives of individual residents, and how can that better drive our decision making around transportation infrastructure, around programming, and around bicycling overall. So that's my 30-minute presentation, and I would just love to have a conversation about this.
Well, thanks, Lance. Appreciate your presentation here and getting us thinking about some of these bicycling issues. It's a little unfortunate that Commissioner Scissors isn't with us today. We hear him comment about bicycling activities frequently from the dais, so probably appreciate some input from him. But do we have thoughts or comments about cycling issues as they relate to our particular city infrastructure?
Commissioner Teskey, could I make a comment?
Go right ahead.
Lance, what I think is important is to connect the wanna cyclist and the gotta cyclist. I think that, my just for personal information, my son owns Over the Edge Sports in Fruta. It's been there 30 years. They built the trails, but what's important and what's neat about Fruta is you can go from his shop downtown Fruta and you can ride in the city and go out to the trails. I think we've seen that with the new, is it the loops, the kitchen loop, the lunch loops? Lunch loops, we had an interconnectivity from the city to trails. So I would like to see that continue. I think that's an important aspect. That's all my point is.
Lance, one of the questions that we ask all the time about what projects can we do and how can we be doing better for the community, having the baseline and the understanding of truly why we're doing them, as is supported by the report that you just gave, but inherently the next question has to come: who pays for it, and what role government has in doing some of these things. So in light of that, how does this conversation plug into every other mode of transportation, whether it be off-road vehicles or cars or trailers or anything? Bicycles is the only one that does not require any sort of fee that helps pay for or accommodate the costs of that infrastructure. How does that plug into this conversation?
Yeah, Keith, that's a fascinating question. And, as you say, there's no gas tax that hits your cyclist. I think that's an interesting question, right? Is how do these get funded? And certainly I don't have, a bottom line answer for you, but it's certainly a question to ask. And maybe one of the attendant questions there is to what extent are other modes responsible for enabling cycling as a mode? I mean, that seems to be one of the ways to think about it, but I think that's an open question.
I would, excuse me, I would share the same sentiments as Keith, because you have car registration fees and other things that allow us to then drive on these streets, and I'm a mountain biker myself. I love biking, but we do have to balance that with, cars are paying, people who own cars are paying fees to drive on roads. I know Denver basically took over some of their street space to create bike lanes, which took away parking spaces, and it didn't increase the biking activity at all. So, that would be my concern is, I don't, like Field of Dreams, I don't know if we build it and they come, because then, if they don't ever come, then we've just taken away, from the stakeholders, roads where they get to drive and park. So this is a complicated issue. And I struggle with it because I see both sides of it. And so I just think it's something we have to think about from a biking standpoint of, if we really want to create this, like he said, who does it boil down to for paying for these things? And then what is taken away, from road access or whatnot? I mean, we've done a good job. I live up in Crestview, and so just north of us on Ridge Drive, we've got the different trails that they're trying to produce through town. So I'd like to see even more studies of people utilizing the bike areas we have, because it'd be nice to know if those are getting utilized enough that it would justify whether the city or somebody gets involved, doing more of those things. Because if there's really a demand and we need to support that, I think it's definitely something more to consider. But I'm not a fan of build it and they will come, because I just don't think that's a wise use of the taxpayer dollar. But that's just my 2 cents. But great presentation. I think that was really good information.
I might like to add on to that as well, in that one thing that wasn't as prominent in your presentation would be the economic side of things, right? That was a very heavy in all of the social welfare and those responsibilities that we have as individuals and community, as well as what level of responsibility a government has in fostering those social elements of it. But we here in the Grand Valley, I think, have a very unique intersection of the economic driver side of it that most communities do not. It is, we can talk about it here as just about it being multimodal and getting to and from work and play and everything else. And that's true. And it's a complete pillar of the foundation of this discussion. But almost like a three-legged stool, there's some other ones that carry the same amount of weight. And I'd be really interested in talking more about how funding for this can come about, because I like those words. It's not a if you build it, they will come on its own. And we do have a unique environment and a unique set of surrounding assets in our public lands and our maintained trail systems that make that interconnectivity for the social side of things tie right in with economic drivers on an industry and an economy that we have chose as a city to fully embrace, and seem to have a unity with our surrounding communities of Fruita and Palisade that this area has not seen before outside of outdoor recreation. So if we were able to really start having a conversation about how those two things tie together and be able to present these kinds of compelling presentations that make the dollars and cents side of it come together with the human side of it, boy, that starts to fit, from my perspective, more into alignment with what the role of government is at the local level. So I'd really love to see more of that.
That's a really, really interesting concept, Commissioner Ellers, and I would be interested in, maybe off the cuff, what mechanisms might exist to capture some of that value of cycling as an economic driver here, and potentially tie it or utilize it to the system. I don't know that we have anything that is that explicit, but I think you're right that it is an economic driver here. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on mechanism.
You might have more information than we know about. The Economic Development Partnership is quite familiar with the various outdoor recreation entities that have come through, funding for things and I'm doing the umbrella of outdoor recreation, which is huge, by the way, right? But the amount of information that had to go in to justify the Palisade plunge and those economic drivers, it's big, right? I think that the number is something like every guest or every rider of the Palisade plunge trail on average will spend $27 a day in the local communities. So we have those figures out there. Other, again, government related that required a lot of backing data, the Cameo shooting range. The BLM goes through different processes for allowing the campgrounds and trailheads out on 18 Road, for example. If the city wasn't in tune with what some of the benefits of connecting the lunch loop trails to downtown with that new trail, and we just did it off of a whim, I would be surprised. I think that there is data there. Furthermore, we have a plethora of new outdoor recreation businesses popping up at a rate that is higher than has historically been. And that data, I think, is out there. It's compelling the private sector enough to say that there's a monetary value to do this. And we ought to be able to extract some of that with little more than an inquisition, at least.
Yeah, I'm sure that there is, a wealth of data out there, and certainly I think there's a broad recognition that it's a major driver of our economy here, and probably will only be more so in the future. I guess I would ask then whether it would be fair to characterize that type of strategy as trying to induce some of our want to bike community to facilitate better conditions for our portion of our community that has to bike, and whether that's really the economic relationship you're describing.
Lance, can I add? I agree with my fellow commissioners. The bottom line is you got to have money, and you can't just keep going with taxpayers. But I think it. So when I was on the city council down in Centennial, and I know you guys are tired of hearing me tell you this, but I was appointed to serve on the Joint Regional Transit Alliance, and that was a huge controversy because it was light rail public transportation, which is really expensive, and when you do that, you got to have collaboration. You got to have collaboration. You got to have mega fundraising. What happened was when the economy is good, the alliance had grand ideas. Well, what happened was when the economy slowed down and when it had some problems, then it couldn't fulfill some of the goals that they wished to do. Some entities could pay for funding and some couldn't. And so you got to look at a lot of things. One of the things that we came up with is it's all fine and dandy to have a nice light rail system. However, you've got to get people from the rest of part of the city to the light rail stations. And that's a huge amount of infrastructure expense. So I don't think biking's as involved as that, but I think that collaboration is important in the valley. I think that you've got to look at, if you do funding sources, who can come to the table and you can leverage your dollars. And then you've got to get a plan out that takes into consideration the bad times and the good times. And so those are just some ideas that I wanted to throw out. But I think I'm against unfunded mandates. Okay, one of the biggest unfunded mandate that we dealt with in the city of Centennial was the federal government with the storm sewer, storm drainage situation. No one had storm. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we were really behind the whole country on storm drainage. And all of a sudden, the federal government passes a regulation and made the municipalities do storm sewer drainage. And we didn't have any money. So we had to create a new special district today and something like that. But I'm kind of getting off the path. But I agree with both commissioners that economics is everything, when it comes to transportation. Thank you for listening to me.
Some ideas to take this past just oh yeah, wouldn't this be great to think about is we just passed a comprehensive plan that completely fails if we don't figure out a way of incentivizing the infill, right? Incentivizing the infill, if we look at the way our current fee systems and where our current allocations go, don't forget, those are all based on our current community understanding, which is cars, traffic, not these bicycle things. So one other area to bring the private sector into paying for this is providing incentives from the traffic impact fee. If you have certain accreditations, whether it be a bikeable community or within certain proximities of this and that, that's one. We have a drainage district that is remarkably in debt and can't seem to figure out how to get this fee structure set up. And yet they're sitting on trail corridors as though they don't even realize that they've got a pot of gold there. User fees, the city's participation in opening those up could allocate immediate corridors, right of way. And again, what I'm doing here is I'm not just throwing out an opinion on who should pay for this and who should pay for that. I'm seeking win-win situations. For the developers, that's a win-win. For the drainage district, that's a win-win. From this seat, that's a win-win. I mean, they have to feel that way too, of course. The federal lands, and when we talk about like OHV, all of the motorcycles, ATVs, four-wheelers that also enjoy our public lands, it doesn't have to be this one size fits all. And in fact, even though they're federal lands, there's no reciprocity between Utah and Colorado, for example. You have to buy a separate tag to go there. So to be able to work with the BLM and come in and say, hey, you're building these trailheads that around here are oftentimes either multi-use OHV and mountain biking, or they're in close enough proximity that some of the trunk systems and trunk infrastructure can sort of fall under the same thing. Well, if we can go to them and talk about how we can join together to champion a registration fee for bicycles, or make it fair and eliminate the registration for OHV. I'm good either way. But for this sake, if they had it too, well, now that conversation also opens up to say, hey, BLM, we understand you're doing infrastructure, but so are we. And to work together here, why don't we talk about how those registration fees end up getting split up? And that is something that I think grows beyond just our valley. It could grow to Western Slope or beyond. So I don't believe that this is just pie in the sky. I think that this is, there are mechanisms here that can make this viable, but not on its own. Again, those three that I listed sort of make at least a three-legged stool that none of them survive without all of them, because it just wouldn't be enough.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Keith. To a great degree, I think our cycling, whether you're a want to or a have to cyclist, and I'm happy that I'm a want to cyclist, you don't generally want to cycle in the same places that you have, arterial traffic flow. And admittedly, the surface roads that we have in the city, throughout the city, could be cycled on by anybody who wants to go ride a bicycle on them. The surface is flat enough, you can ride a bike on it. But you got to ride in traffic. And as you pointed out, that graph with these sort of 3 different or 4 different types of cyclists, right? Those who are strong and confident and are going to ride anywhere, any conditions. These are rarer people. Then you've got a slightly larger group of people who are pretty confident, pretty willing to go pretty much anywhere, pretty much any conditions, but they are concerned about safety. And then you've got the overwhelming majority of cyclists, whether you are a want to or a have to cyclist, who just don't want to contend with the risk of death that goes with riding on the street. So that's a fairly significant infrastructure issue. And as we're talking about drainage rights of way or irrigation canal banks, these are places where there isn't a significant existing vehicular traffic, automotive traffic that could be utilized by cyclists to cycle on. We have an economic problem with constructing that infrastructure. Who's going to pay for that? We have some right-of-way acquisition issues, which are fairly prominent in our community with those entities that already control that right-of-way. They don't want to share. And part of that is a vision issue. I'm sure there are legal liability concerns and issues out there as well that we'd have to find some way to navigate through. And, maybe something like user fees or, registration for bicycles that are going to use those facilities is a good way, potentially a good way to deal with that. And I think you're making a good point as well, that outdoor recreation is such a gigantic economic component of what happens locally from a broader economic point of view, that sales and use taxes, things like that are being contributed by people who want to cyclists to a very great degree. And so those people and their ability to cycle from, say their short-term rental here in downtown to 18 Road would be a huge benefit to attracting those people to stay here and to want to ride their bikes around town, which is what we all sort of expect. So there is some synergy there between our desire for want-to cyclists to be able to get to the trailheads from downtown or wherever they're staying, and have-to cyclists being able to use those same connections to get from one place to another inside the city limits.
Yeah, I think this is all fantastic and valuable information and ideas. And it sounds like one of the key concepts that we're all zooming in here is on how do you build an economic relationship in the coalition between those who choose to bicycle, whether they're residents or visitors, and those who may not have the means to be contributing to that system, but are very much in need of that system being developed. And I think that's a great principle from which to build maybe a more concentrated set of programs and policies around this information, right? Is to say, well, what are the mechanisms? And as Keith, you say, how do you make them stable win-wins that actually provide for a future there that is not just maybe the untenable situation where you're kind of putting money in that doesn't exist, or as George, you say, unfunded mandate being the type of thing you want to avoid here. So this is all, I think, very, very interesting input, and something good to take back to our Urban Trails Committee.
I would love to hear just people who have to bike in town, where they're utilizing, what challenges that they see. I know years ago they created the lanes on Elm. So just anecdotally, I grew up here and we would ride from 30 Road to the mall, taking canal roads and Elm as far as we could get to First Street. So we did it. That's when our parents didn't care where we went and what we did. But so it's remarkably better. Granted, that was 20 some odd years ago, but I would just love to hear how the people that have to bike, they're not the wanna bikers, but what challenges do they see? What would they like? Because I think that's, we're getting it right from the source versus I think I would say most of us, we get to be part of the wannabe group, and I drive my car to the trail. I don't ride to the trail, and I think you see that. You see the trailheads are booked, they're packed with cars, and that's a nice luxury to have. And like you said, that's a different aspect from the have-to people. I do see college students obviously a lot, on 12th, and that's, a great means for them. But for people who are really, trying to get around town because they have to get from their house to their job, I'd really love to hear what challenges they have and what they'd like to see. I think for me, that would be really beneficial. So.
Actually, another great source of information, and because I love getting the anecdotals of how does it apply here, right? And for free information and free survey stuff, I love picking on CMU and those opportunities. Those professors love chances to put their students to work. I've utilized it in both the private sector and otherwise. They're really a great resource. And so what came to mind in this is out in Palisade, we see this, right? What Andrea was just speaking to certainly speaks to our have-to community, or at least in large part. And what are they experiencing in more of our urban and tighter suburban side of it? But Palisade is a nice little glimpse into the surrounding areas of Junction as well. And I'll tell you, if you keep championing this thing and you want a great graphic to, other than that sliding bar of your little percentage of the enthusiastic and then the this and that, go find any road that a bachelorette party is driving down in Palisade, because they all have cars and they get on there, and up front is this, rah, let's go get them girls, and she's biking, having a great time. And then it goes to, this is kind of fun, I'm glad Terry's here to lead us. And then there's this middle part of, we're here for Susan. And inevitably there is at least one or two at the end just going, I don't like sweating, I don't like pedaling, all of these things. It would be the greatest graphic. And that's fun to talk about, but legitimately they've got to have stories. And especially after they're done drinking wine, hey, you have vehicles, you guys could all get there. Why are you doing this? Maybe it's because we don't want to get a DUI. Maybe it's because it feels good. I don't know, but gosh, there's a wealth of information there, and it shows up about every 40 minutes on any given road out there in the summer.
Well, Commissioner, that's vivid and certainly worth maybe tucking into this presentation. And I do like the idea of maybe recruiting CMU students. I mean, this would be a great project. Get CMU students out there and just have them interview, like 20 cyclists each, and get the whole gamut going. Just maybe two anecdotes that might be of relevance here. One is the Urban Trails Committee did a survey about 4 months ago that got about 205 responses to it, and only 2 people that took the survey responded as being bound to bicycling as a mode, i.e. they didn't have a car or that it was their primary mode, which I think speaks to maybe that dimension of political participation of various demographics of cyclists. And so that was a challenge, because we were hoping to get more data on this. And I think, because we didn't really push that issue with a huge amount of resources, it didn't pan out that way. Another anecdote is a series of recent conversations about North Avenue. So CDOT was looking at median redesigns along North Avenue, and we were having several conversations about how do you redesign this facility. And many comments were made to the effect of, well, we don't want to put bike lanes on North Avenue because we really don't want to encourage people to be riding on North Avenue because it's not a safe facility. And the reply was made by another person on that call that there are already people biking on North Avenue. And so maybe it's not about if you build it, they will come. It's that they're there should you not build it for them. And I think that is the fundamental interplay between ideas here. Is it build it, they will come, or is it they're here? What do we owe in terms of facility quality?
Well, that's you just triggered something in my mind that there's been a huge deal on a number of projects. The most recent one would be North River Road out of Palisade. So heading east right out of that Main Street Palisade between the railroad tracks and the river. So Mesa County and Palisade are trying to work on creating better bike lanes for that road. Well, in the community, there's all these talks about, oh, here's what we can do and yada, yada. And the two ways of designing it that came out as sort of the leaders was, okay, you shrink the lanes down to an appropriate size. It's still the right size for safety, but now you have X amount of feet for a bike lane. And one train of thought was, we should detach that bike lane and have it a big wide one on one side of the road where there's back and forth oncoming bicycle traffic. And the other one was, no, just split that up and add it to the shoulders of the road. Well, by the time it got done, and I'm not sure what the process was, I know that it wasn't a clear and transparent one from my perspective watching it. it landed on, the engineer said, we're going to add 4 feet to either side of the road. And now there's a bike lane on either side of the road. Me as a bicycler, especially after drinking wine, 4 feet's not enough, right? There's some wobble, sorry. And more importantly though, as a father, I don't take my kids on that. No way in hell, right? But if it's detached, I do. Now that's just an opinion, totally there. But it begs the question of like North Avenue, right? Well, how are we designing them? And is it comfortable? You know, long ago, there was the conversations about our streets downtown. I can't remember which ones exactly, but we have detached walks, right? And there's a grass strip and trees in between. And some of our larger arterial cross sections call for that as well. There's challenges that go along with that. Who maintains it? What does that look like? Yada, yada. But I wanted to, you really triggered gosh, when these projects have happened, whether or not you really at the end of the day feel like they're done, largely depends on the design. I'll throw one other example out, which would be the trail connection, supposedly the river trail connection between Fruita and Grand Junction. Yes, do people use it? Absolutely, they do. But that was one that through the design stage was, yeah, portions of it is along the river as was otherwise intended. And there continues to be easements reserved on some of the properties along the way. But because they couldn't get it all done and we didn't want to wait, we threw that river trail up and now it's adjacent to a frontage road and I-70. That's a different feel. That's not the river trail. There's good reasons and merits for all of it. But the point there is that as we get into the more suburban areas and talk about how do these corridors look, I think, or I wonder, I'm asking the question as to why does the engineering community tend to go one way and maybe more of the landscape architecture or multimodal communities tend to go a different way? There's a gap there. I wonder if we can ask why and bring it together.
Well, Commissioner, from my perspective, that's a question that's probably best reserved for asking a higher power why engineers and landscape architects don't see eye to eye. But it's certainly, I think, the lived experience of everybody who works on this type of infrastructure that different professions and people with different goals in mind see the ideal outcome in very different ways. And there's an interplay between different versions of pragmatism. I think different professions see what is pragmatic in many different respects, and depending on where you're looking, the practicality that you're trying to achieve is just being defined on different terms. So I think this has been a very, very valuable discussion, certainly for me, and I think the Urban Trails Committee will be very interested in some of these comments. And I just really appreciate you all taking the time to think about this and maybe fold it into your ongoing considerations as projects come forward and opportunities arise.
Lance, would you be willing, I think Commissioner Teskey hit right on it, that Commissioner Scissors, this is a topic that is important to him and near and dear. He obviously wasn't able to make it today, but before you go back to the Trails Committee, would you have the resources to reach out to him individually?
Absolutely.
Thanks.
All right, well, I think that fairly well wraps up our conversation for today. Lance, do you have anything further for us?
No, thanks for joining us, and I hope you enjoy having an hour instead of an hour and a half today.
I have a question before we go. I saw Kim's email right before this saying that she resigned. So what does our panel versus alternate look like now?
Maybe I can answer that. So I received word from Wanda and the city clerk that our first alternate would move into her position. So that would be you, Andrea. And then we will start a recruitment effort for that second alternate position. So hopefully that helps.
That's helpful. All right, well, thanks everyone. Appreciate your time today, and we have a meeting next Tuesday, right? The 9th?
That's correct.
Fantastic. Well, we'll see everyone then.